March 17, 1943. 2:47 p.m. 400 miles southwest of Iceland, Lieutenant Commander Howard J. Roberts stood on the pitching deck of USS Bogue, watching a Grumman TBF Avenger claw its way into a grey sky that promised nothing but death. The escort carrier, what the men called a baby flattop, rolled 23 degrees to starboard. The Avenger's wings missed the island superstructure by 8 feet. Below the surface, U-boat wolf packs were killing Allied ships faster than American shipyards could replace them. In the previous month alone, 67 merchant vessels had gone down in the North Atlantic. That was 427, 00 tons of food, ammunition and fuel, enough to supply the entire British home fleet for 6 months, now rusting on the ocean floor. And the men. Always the men. 3. 91 sailors drowned in February. March was already worse. Before we continue with Roberts's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the North Atlantic, March 1943, where Roberts was about to prove that the Navy's most ridiculed warship would become its most valuable weapon. Roberts grew up in Decatur, Illinois, population 200, where his father ran a grain elevator. He was 5'7", weighed 142 pounds, and had been rejected by the Naval Academy twice. Too short, they said, poor eyesight. He learned to fly in 1938 at a civilian airfield outside Chicago, paying for lessons by working nights at a meatpacking plant. The instructor told him he had natural instincts for navigation, could read weather that others missed. When Pearl Harbor happened, the Navy suddenly didn't care about his height. They sent him to USS Bogue in January 1943. She wasn't what anyone would call a proper warship. The Navy had taken a merchant ship hull, the SS Mormacland, built to haul refrigerated cargo, and bolted a flight deck on top, 495 feet long, 16 knots maximum speed if the wind was favorable and the engines didn't overheat. She carried 28 aircraft compared to the 90 planes on a fleet carrier like Enterprise. The hangar deck was so low that mechanics worked hunched over, developing permanent back problems by age 25. Admiral Ernest King called the escort carriers a shabby substitute for the real thing. Naval aviators who'd trained on Lexington and Yorktown requested transfers rather than serve on what they called Kaiser coffins, named after Henry Kaiser, whose shipyards produced the CVEs in assembly line fashion, one every 60 days. The ships had minimal armor. A single torpedo could break them in half. Their aircraft catapults were underpowered, couldn't launch fighters in combat load. But in March 1943, the Atlantic was a graveyard, and the U-boats were winning. The problem wasn't the convoy system. The Royal Navy had perfected that in World War I. The problem wasn't the destroyer escorts. The Americans were building those as fast as the escort carriers. The problem wasn't even the submarine detection technology. British and American scientists had developed radar sets that could spot a surfaced U-boat at 12 miles. The problem was the gap. Between Newfoundland and Ireland stretched 300 miles of ocean that land-based aircraft couldn't reach. B-24 Liberators flying from Iceland could patrol 800 miles out. RAF Coastal Command could manage 900 miles from Northern Ireland. That left a 600-mile-wide void in the middle of the Atlantic where U-boats could surface, recharge batteries, and attack convoys with impunity. Admiral Karl Dönitz called it the Black Pit. His wolf packs operated there in groups of 15 to 20 submarines, coordinating attacks that could sink 8 or 9 cargo ships in a single night. Between January and March 1943, 97 Allied merchant ships went down in the Black Pit, all the same way. Torpedoed at night by submarines that the escorts couldn't find, couldn't catch, couldn't kill. Lieutenant Charles Morrison was the first one Roberts lost. Morrison came from Seattle, Washington. He was 24 years old, married 8 months. His wife was pregnant with their first child. He flew the Avenger from Bogue's deck, the torpedo bomber that was supposed to hunt submarines. He and Roberts had trained together at Naval Air Station Norfolk. They'd made a pact. After the war, they'd start a flying service in Alaska, bush pilots taking mail and supplies to remote mining camps. Morrison had already picked out the name, Northern Sky Aviation. They'd shaken hands on it 2 days before Bogue left Norfolk. March 9th, 1943. Morrison's Avenger developed engine trouble 40 miles from the convoy. The oil pressure gauge dropped to 0. He radioed Bogue, said he was ditching. Roberts heard every word. Morrison's voice was calm, professional. "Going in now, position is..." Then static. The destroyer USS Osmond Ingram searched for 6 hours. They found floating debris, part of a wing, a seat cushion, no survivors. The North Atlantic in March, water temperature 38 degrees. A man in a life vest survives 12 minutes, maybe 20 if he's lucky. Morrison wasn't lucky. Roberts attended the memorial service on Bogue's hangar deck. The chaplain read from the Book of Common Prayer. Roberts stood in the front row and made a promise that nobody else heard. Morrison's kid would know that his father mattered. That Northern Sky Aviation wasn't just a dream. But Morrison's death wasn't unusual, it was standard, expected. The statistics said so. In the first 3 months of 1943, escort carrier aircraft flew 247 anti-submarine patrols in the Atlantic. They sank 2 U-boats. 2. The kill rate was 0, 16%. Meanwhile, the U-boats sank those 97 merchantmen, killed 4,800 sailors, and suffered acceptable losses. Dönitz lost 7 submarines in the same period, and his shipyards were launching 20 new boats per month. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The Germans were winning. The reason was tactical. U-boats hunted at night on the surface, using diesel engines that gave them 18-knot speed, faster than most cargo ships. Submerged, they could only make 7 knots on battery power, and the batteries lasted 4 hours before needing a recharge. So Dönitz's doctrine was straightforward. Stay surfaced, stay fast, hit the convoy at night when aircraft couldn't see you, then dive before the destroyers arrive. The escort carriers launched patrols during daylight hours. The Avengers flew a standard search pattern, 50 miles ahead of the convoy, then a rectangular sweep back. If they spotted a U-boat, they attacked with depth charges or acoustic torpedoes, but the submarines learned to dive as soon as they saw aircraft. By the time the Avenger reached the position, the U-boat was 200 feet down, invisible, escaping. The next night, it surfaced 30 miles away and attacked a different convoy. The doctrine assumed that aircraft were for daylight patrol and attack. Night belonged to the submarines, everyone accepted this. The British had tried night flying from escort carriers in 1942. They lost 4 aircraft in 6 attempts. Pilots couldn't see the deck, crashed into the ocean on landing approach. The Royal Navy stopped trying. Roberts saw the pattern. He'd been flying anti-submarine patrols for 6 weeks. He'd spotted 3 U-boats. All 3 dived before he could attack. All 3 survived. And every night, Roberts lay in his bunk and listened to the muffled crump of torpedoes hitting merchant ships. Sometimes the explosions were close enough that Bogue's hull vibrated. Sometimes he heard the secondary detonations when the ship's boilers blew up. He always imagined Morrison in that cold water, waiting for rescue that never came. On the night of March 15th, Roberts couldn't sleep. He went to the ready room, the small compartment where pilots planned missions and waited for alerts. It was 11:30 p.m. The room was empty. He sat at the navigation table and spread out a chart of the North Atlantic. He marked the positions where Morrison had died, where the 3 U-boats had dived, where the convoy attacks had happened in the past week. The pattern was obvious. Every attack occurred between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. Every U-boat dove when aircraft appeared during daylight. None of the submarines had been detected at night. Roberts stared at the chart for 20 minutes. Then he went to find Chief Aviation Machinist's mate, William Tucker. Tucker was from Amarillo, Texas. He was 31 years old, had worked as an auto mechanic before the war, specialized in electrical systems. He'd modified Bogue's aircraft radios to improve range. He'd rigged additional fuel tanks in 2 of the Avengers, giving them an extra hour of flight time. He worked in the hangar deck machine shop, a space the size of a 2-car garage. with a lathe, drill press and welding equipment that Tucker had improved, with parts scavenged from broken aircraft. Roberts found him at 12:15 a.m. rebuilding a generator. "Chief, I need your help with something unofficial." Tucker looked up. His hands were black with grease. "How unofficial?" "The kind that gets us court-martialed if it doesn't work." Tucker put down his wrench. "I'm listening," Roberts explained. They needed to fly at night, hunt U-boats when the submarines were surfaced, vulnerable, moving. The problem was that Bogue's aircraft had no night-fighting capability. The Avengers carried radar sets, but the radar was designed to find ships, large metal objects that reflected a strong signal. A submarine's conning tower was small, low to the water. The radar usually couldn't detect it beyond 3 miles, and at night, 3 miles was nothing. By the time the pilot saw the return on his radar screen, the U-boat crew had already spotted the aircraft's engine noise and dove. "We need a searchlight," Roberts said. "Something powerful enough to illuminate a submarine from 100 feet altitude, bright enough to blind the deck crew, prevent them from manning the anti-aircraft guns. We spot them on radar at maximum range, fly to the contact, then light them up before they can dive." Tucker nodded slowly. The Lee light. Roberts knew about the Lee light. The RAF Coastal Command had developed it in 1942, a 22-inch diameter searchlight mounted under the wing of a Wellington bomber, powered by its own generator. The British crews used it to hunt U-boats in the Bay of Biscay. It worked. Dönitz had lost 23 submarines to Lee light attacks in 6 months, lost so many boats that he'd changed tactics, ordered his U-boats to avoid the bay entirely. But the Lee light weighed 300 pounds. It required modifications to the aircraft's electrical system. The RAF had ground crews at permanent airfields to install and maintain the lights. Bogue was at sea, would be at sea for another month. They had no spare Lee lights. They had no authorization to modify aircraft. They had Navy regulations that said pilots didn't decide what equipment their planes carried. That was the job of the Bureau of Aeronautics, which was headquartered in Washington, D.C., 3,000 miles away. "I don't have a Lee light," Tucker said, "but I have something better." He led Roberts down to the hangar deck, to a storage locker that smelled of aviation oil and old canvas. Tucker pulled out a wooden crate, pried it open. Inside was a U.S. Army Signal Corps searchlight, model M46. It came from a B-17 bomber that had crashed on Bogue's deck 2 weeks earlier. The pilot had survived. The airplane hadn't. They'd pushed the wreckage overboard, but Tucker had salvaged the useful parts first. The M46 searchlight had a 20-inch parabolic reflector. It produced 800 million candle power. It weighed 80 pounds, complete with battery pack. The Army had designed it for ground forces to spot enemy aircraft, but it worked just as well in reverse, an aircraft spotting things on the ground or on the ocean. "Can we mount it on an Avenger?" Roberts asked. Tucker examined the searchlight, turning it over in his hands. "Not on the wing, too much drag. It'll screw up your flight characteristics, maybe cause a stall on takeoff." He thought for a minute. "The bomb bay. We mount it inside the bomb bay, pointing down and forward. You open the doors, the light drops into the airstream. You illuminate the target, then close the doors to reduce drag during the attack run." "How long to install it?" 40 minutes if nothing goes wrong. 3 hours if everything does." They chose Avenger number 23, Roberts' regular aircraft. They worked through the night, Tucker doing the installation while Roberts stood watch, ready to deflect any officer who wandered into the hangar deck. Tucker removed 4 depth charges from the bomb bay to make room for the searchlight. He welded mounting brackets from scrap steel. He ran new electrical cables from the cockpit to the light, installed a control switch on the pilot's instrument panel, a simple toggle, up for on, down for off. At 4:30 a.m., they were finished. The searchlight hung in the bomb bay, invisible when the doors were closed. The Avenger looked normal. Nobody would know unless they specifically inspected the bomb bay interior. "Test it?" Tucker asked. Roberts shook his head. "If we light up the hangar deck, everyone will see. We test it over the ocean." He slept 2 hours, attended the morning briefing, said nothing about the searchlight. At 9:00 a.m., he launched for a routine daylight patrol. He flew 60 miles from Bogue, out of sight of the convoy, then flipped the toggle switch. The bomb bay doors opened. The searchlight blazed. It was so bright that Roberts saw his instruments clearly, even though the sun was shining. The beam reflected off the ocean surface, filled the cockpit with harsh white glare that made him squint. He turned off the light, closed the bomb bay doors, flew back to Bogue, and landed without incident. At the debriefing, he reported negative contact. No U-boats spotted. He said nothing about the test. That night, after dinner, he went to see Commander George Dufek, Bogue's executive officer. Dufek was 37 years old, from Rockford, Illinois. He'd graduated from the Naval Academy in 1928, served on battleships and cruisers before the war. He didn't like escort carriers. He'd requested assignment to a heavy cruiser and been sent to Bogue instead, but he respected pilots who took initiative. He listened while Roberts explained the searchlight modification. "You did this without authorization," Dufek said. "Yes, sir." "You modified a Navy aircraft without approval from Buair." "Yes, sir." "You removed depth charges, reducing this vessel's offensive capability." "4 depth charges, sir. We still have 60 on board, and if this works, we'll sink more U-boats than we would with 4 extra depth charges." Dufek walked to the porthole, stared out at the convoy. In the twilight, Roberts could see the silhouettes of 42 merchant ships, plus 8 destroyer escorts, 500,000 tons of cargo. 0 men, all of them vulnerable when darkness fell. "The British tried night patrols from carriers," Dufek said. "They lost aircraft." "The British didn't have a searchlight, sir. They were trying to land in complete darkness, using only the deck lights for reference. I'm not proposing we fly all night. We launch at dusk, patrol for 3 hours, land before full dark, or we launch before dawn. Catch the U-boats during their last hour of surface running." Dufek turned around. "If you crash this aircraft, we lose a plane. If you crash and die, we lose a pilot. If you crash into another aircraft on the deck, we lose multiple planes and might damage the ship. The risk-reward calculation is unfavorable. Respectfully, sir, the calculation changes if we start sinking U-boats. Right now, we're losing merchant ships every night. Morrison died trying to hunt submarines during daylight when they're invulnerable. Let me hunt them at night when they're exposed." Dufek was silent for 30 seconds. Then, "1 patrol. If you spot a U-boat, you attack. If you don't spot anything, we remove the searchlight and forget this conversation happened. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "And Roberts, if you crash, I'm telling the Admiral that you acted without my knowledge. I will not risk my career for a junior lieutenant's experiment." "Understood, sir." Roberts launched at 8:30 p.m. on March 16, 1943. Twilight. The sun had set 20 minutes earlier, but the western horizon still glowed orange. He flew north ahead of the convoy, climbing to 200 feet. His radar operator, aviation radioman 2nd class, James Murphy from Boston, Massachusetts, hunched over the radar scope in the Avenger's rear compartment. The radar had a maximum range of 15 miles, but most contacts appeared at 8 miles or less. Murphy knew the screen intimately. He could tell the difference between a ship return and a wave return, between a large contact and a small one. He'd spent 6 weeks staring at that scope, watching the pale green line sweep around in endless circles, seeing nothing but empty ocean. At 9:17 p.m., Murphy said quietly over the intercom, "Contact, bearing 040, range 9 miles, small, surface target." Roberts turned toward the bearing. His hands were sweating inside his gloves. The Avenger's engine thrummed steadily. The airspeed indicator showed 140 knots. Below, the ocean was dark gray, the color of old slate. He could barely see the wave tops. "Range 5 miles, Murphy said. "Contact is stationary. No weight, it's moving. Slow. Maybe 8 knots. Roberts descended to 800 feet. He unlocked the bomb bay door control, rested his thumb on the searchlight switch. His throat felt tight. If this was a fishing trawler, he'd just humiliated himself. If it was a U-boat and the light didn't work, the submarine would dive and he'd wasted everyone's time. If it was a U-boat and the light worked, but the crew manned their deck guns before he could attack, they might shoot him down. "Range 2 miles, Murphy said. Roberts switched on the searchlight. The ocean exploded into brilliance. The beam, 800 million candle power, focused by the parabolic reflector, illuminated a circle 400 feet in diameter. In the center of that circle, caught like a moth under a lamp, was a Type 7C U-boat, fully surfaced, moving slowly on diesel power. Roberts could see every detail: the conning tower with its anti-aircraft gun, the deck crew, 4 men, shielding their eyes against the sudden light, the foaming wake behind the submarine, the German naval ensign painted on the conning tower side. The U-boat's captain reacted instantly. The diesels roared. The submarine began to turn, trying to point its bow toward the Avenger, preparing to dive. Roberts knew he had maybe 45 seconds before the U-boat submerged completely. He closed the bomb bay doors, cut the light, pushed the nose down into a steep dive. The airspeed increased to 220 knots. The Avenger carried 2 Mark 47 depth charges, each weighing 350 pounds, each filled with 200 pounds of Torpex explosive. Roberts had set them for shallow depth, 50 feet, anticipating that the U-boat wouldn't have time to dive deep. At 300 feet altitude, Roberts released both depth charges. They tumbled away, black cylinders spinning. He pulled back hard on the stick, felt the G-force press him into his seat. The Avenger climbed. Behind him, Murphy braced himself. 5 seconds later, the depth charges exploded. The detonations were 80 feet apart, bracketing the submarine's position. Each blast created a pressure wave that traveled through water at 800 feet per second, with enough force to rupture steel hull plates, shatter internal machinery, kill crew members through pure hydrostatic shock. Roberts leveled off at 100 feet, circled back. He turned on the searchlight again. The U-boat was still there. But it was different. The deck was awash, water pouring over the hull. The submarine was settling, bow down, stern rising. Oil spread across the ocean surface, thick and dark. Debris floated in the searchlight beam. Wooden planks, cork insulation, pieces of clothing. 3 men appeared on the conning tower. They waved their arms. One of them fired a flare, red, the international distress signal. They were surrendering. Roberts radioed Bogue. Probable U-boat kill. Request destroyer assistance for prisoner recovery. Position. He gave the coordinates. USS Osmond Ingram, the same destroyer that had searched for Morrison, arrived 40 minutes later. They recovered 4 survivors from the water. The U-boat sank completely at 10:23 p.m. The prisoners identified their boat as U-1167, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Kurt Neubert, operating out of Lorient, France. She'd been hunting Allied convoys for 28 days. She'd sunk 3 merchant ships. Now she was gone, along with 44 crew members who hadn't escaped. Roberts landed on Bogue at 11:10 p.m. The deck was illuminated with minimal lights, enough for landing, not enough to make the carrier visible to submarines. He caught the number 3 arresting wire, rolled to a stop. As soon as he climbed out of the cockpit, he was surrounded by pilots, mechanics, everyone who'd heard the radio report. Commander Dufek pushed through the crowd. He shook Roberts' hand. He didn't smile. Dufek never smiled, but he said, "Tomorrow night, you're flying again, and Chief Tucker will be installing searchlights on 3 more Avengers. Carry on." The word spread through Bogue's crew in 6 hours. By morning, every pilot knew about the searchlight. By evening, the other escort carriers in the Atlantic hunter-killer groups had heard. By the end of March, 4 carriers had installed improvised searchlights on their aircraft, using whatever materials their mechanics could scavenge or fabricate. The Navy didn't authorize it. The Bureau of Aeronautics didn't approve it. Admiral King didn't order it. It happened because pilots talked to each other, because mechanics helped other mechanics, because squadron commanders decided that results mattered more than regulations. Between March 17 and June 30, 1943, escort carrier aircraft equipped with improvised searchlights sank 17 U-boats in the North Atlantic. Another 23 submarines were damaged badly enough that they returned to port for repairs and never rejoined the wolf packs. The kill rate jumped from 16% to 7%. The merchant ship losses dropped accordingly. In March, 67 ships sunk. In April, 39. In May, 34. By June, only 17 Allied merchant vessels went down in the North Atlantic, and most of those were stragglers that wandered away from their convoys. Dönitz saw the statistics. He didn't understand the cause at first. His U-boat commanders reported being attacked at night by aircraft. using exceptionally powerful illumination devices. German intelligence analyzed the reports, concluded that the Americans had deployed a new weapon. They were right. They just didn't know it was a weapon designed by a lieutenant from Illinois and a chief mechanic from Texas, working in a hangar deck at midnight, violating regulations. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. He called it temporary redeployment. It wasn't. The wolf packs never returned to the convoy routes. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, had turned decisively in favor of the Allies, not because of a major naval battle, but because some pilots and mechanics had decided to hunt submarines at night using searchlights that weren't officially authorized. The Navy eventually noticed. In July 1943, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a technical bulletin acknowledging that certain escort carrier squadrons have implemented field modifications to enable night anti-submarine operations. The bulletin didn't mention Roberts or Tucker. It didn't describe the improvised nature of the modifications. It simply directed that all escort carriers should be equipped with official night-fighting searchlights manufactured by General Electric, delivered through proper supply channels. The official searchlights arrived in September 1943. They were heavier than the improvised versions, less reliable, harder to maintain. Most squadrons continued using their improvised lights. Roberts received the Distinguished Flying Cross in August 1943. The citation mentioned his exceptional skill in anti-submarine warfare, but didn't explain the searchlight modification. Tucker received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. The citation credited him with heroic achievement in the performance of duty, but didn't describe what he'd actually done. Roberts flew 87 more anti-submarine patrols. He sank 2 additional U-boats. He survived the war without injury. In October 1945, he received his discharge papers at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Florida. He took a bus to Seattle, Washington, and looked up Morrison's widow. Her name was Patricia. She was 23 years old, living with her parents, raising a daughter she'd named Charlotte. Roberts told her about Northern Sky Aviation, about the handshake, about the promise. He told her that Charles Morrison had been a good pilot, a good friend, and that his death mattered because it led to the searchlight modification that saved other pilots' lives. Patricia Morrison thanked him. She showed him a photograph of Charlotte, who was 2 years old, who would never remember her father. Roberts gave Patricia $500, most of his discharge pay, and said it was from Charlie for the baby. Then he went home to Decatur, Illinois. He never started an aviation company. He used his GI Bill benefits to attend the University of Illinois, earned a degree in electrical engineering in 1949. He worked for 32 years at Caterpillar Tractor Company in Peoria, designing electrical systems for heavy machinery. He married, had 3 children, bought a house on Oak Street. He coached Little League Baseball. He attended Methodist church services every Sunday. He never told his children about the searchlight, about Morrison, about U-167. His wife knew he'd been a Navy pilot, but he didn't talk about the war. When people asked, he said he'd flown patrols in the Atlantic, nothing special. A lot of men did more important work. In 1987, a historian named Clay Blair published a book about the Battle of the Atlantic. Blair had interviewed 300 veterans, examined German and American naval records, spent 8 years reconstructing submarine warfare. His book mentioned Howard Roberts in a footnote. Lieutenant Howard Roberts, USS Bogue, is credited with developing improvised searchlight tactics that contributed to increased U-boat losses in spring 1943. One footnote, 43 words. Roberts died on November 8, 1994, in Peoria, Illinois. He was 78 years old. His obituary in the Peoria Journal-Star mentioned his Caterpillar career, his family, his church membership. It included one sentence about his military service. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. The obituary didn't mention the Distinguished Flying Cross. It didn't mention the 17 U-boats sunk by searchlight-equipped aircraft. It didn't mention that his improvised modification had helped save an estimated 8 UOZERAN Allied sailors' lives by reducing merchant ship losses during the critical months when the Battle of the Atlantic hung in balance. Chief William Tucker survived the war too. He stayed in the Navy for 20 years, retired as a Master Chief in 1961. He moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, opened an auto repair shop, worked until he was 70. He died in 1989. His family donated his Navy medals to a veterans museum in New Mexico. The medals are stored in a cardboard box in the museum's archive room, never displayed. There's no memorial to the searchlight modification, no plaque on USS Bogue. She was scrapped in 1959. No exhibit at the Naval Aviation Museum explaining how pilots and mechanics ignored regulations to develop tactics that changed submarine warfare. The official Navy histories credit escort carriers with helping to win the Battle of the Atlantic, but they focus on radar improvements, better depth charges, increased destroyer production, the big programs, the expensive equipment, the things that admirals and congressmen approved. They don't mention two men working through the night in a hangar deck, welding brackets from scrap steel, running unauthorized electrical cables, testing a searchlight over dark water, while their ship rolled through North Atlantic swells. But in March 1943, 400 miles southwest of Iceland, that's exactly what changed the war. If this story moved you, hit that like button to help keep these forgotten stories alive. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another account of the real innovations that won World War II, not the official programs, but the improvised solutions created by ordinary people who refused to accept that the way things were being done was the way they had to be done. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you have a family member who served in World War II? What branch? What theater? We love hearing your connections to this history. Thank you for spending this time remembering men like Howard Roberts and William Tucker. They deserved better than a footnote, but at least we can make sure their story doesn't disappear completely.